Good evening. I'll try that again. Good evening. My name is Bilal Sekou. I am an associate professor of political science here at the University of Hartford, and I will be moderating tonight's third session of the two Connecticut's conversations about race and place. First, a big thank you to our sponsors who made this series possible. The University of Hartford's President's College and Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, the Third Age Initiative, a program of Leadership Greater Hartford, and the Connecticut Mirror News organization. Thank you to all of you who have joined us tonight. We're so glad you are here. Please remember, if you haven't done so already, sign up for the remaining sessions, on regionalism on December 8th. Just go to the University of Hartford's website under Community Conversations or the Leadership Greater Hartford website under the Events tab. In addition to this gathering, tonight's program is also being offered virtually and is being recorded. The recordings will be available on the website of Leadership Greater Hartford and the University of Hartford's Office of Diversity and Community Engagement. Because we are recording visual and audio, some in-person audience members could be in camera view, but rest assured, the camera is not focusing on the audience, it's focusing on our great set of panelists here. We will take questions from both our in-person and virtual audience. Our virtual audience can ask questions by typing it into the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen. Our in-person audience can write questions on an index card and raise your hand when you're ready for someone to pick that card up. Don't wait to the very end, but raise your hand and someone will come by and pick that card up from you. In either case, please say if your question is for a specific panelist or any one of them. We will collect the questions and ask as many as possible after our initial conversation. We call it the two Connecticuts because our state has two distinct sub-societies, predominantly people of color and poor people living in core cities, and predominantly white people living in the suburbs and exurbs. The purpose of tonight's discussion, the third in this series, is to talk about the intersection of education and racism. A large part of why we have two Connecticuts is racism. Racism in the past and racism in the present. We hope you leave tonight and our final session eager to learn more and become active in the work to address the great disparities many of our citizens suffer here in Connecticut. So let me turn to our panel. First, we have Jack Dougherty, who is professor and director of educational studies at Trinity College. He and his students use tools for digital history, data visualization, and web writing to explore the relationship between cities, suburbs, and schools in metropolitan Hartford, Connecticut. Jack. Claudia Tenaglia, did I get it right? Close enough? Tenaglia is a teacher of social studies at Dwight Bellizzi Dual Language Academy, a Title I middle school in Hartford. A teacher for more than 15 years, Claudia has taught in both public and private schools in 3 different countries and served in the Peace Corps working with youth in Ukraine. She has done advocacy work with the organization Educators for Excellence, drafting policy recommendations to the state legislature around the inequities and pandemic, how the inequities and pandemic has magnified in our education system. Finally, we have Ruth-Terry Walden. She is a teacher of literature in Westhill High School in Stamford. A lawyer by trade, she served as the director of the South Bronx Community Organization, Neighborhood Youth and Family Services. She also has worked with the Yale School of Medicine, serving as the assistant director of clinical trials, grant, and contract administration. For the past 20 years, she has been an educator in Stamford. And I especially want to thank our 2 public school educators who are here today. We owe a tremendous amount to the work you do in bringing students and sending students, for example, here to the University of Hartford. As last month's session on housing demonstrated, Connecticut is one of the most residentially segregated states in the country due to restrictive zoning within affluent towns, white flight from the cities, redlining, and other policies. Basing school attendance in local schools, basing school attendance on towns' boundaries produces similarly high rates of segregation in local schools, producing some of the most segregated schools in the country with all the inherent negative consequences for Black, Latino, and white students. In 1996, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled in the Sheff versus O'Neill lawsuit that Hartford students were unconstitutionally isolated, racially, ethnically, and economically. The court attributed this in part to the state's creation of local school districts. In response, magnet schools were developed along with the open choice busing program, both of which allowed students to attend schools across the district and town lines. This slide shows the increased percentage of Hartford students in integrated schools, mostly magnet schools, but it also shows that a majority of Black and Latinx students are still in segregated schools. So let me ask the first question of Jack tonight. Has Sheff done enough to reduce racial, ethnic, and economic isolation in the schools?
Great. Thanks, Bilal. It's a great question. And do you mind if we reframe it just a little bit? That first part of it, has Sheff succeeded or Sheff failed? Whenever people frame it that way in the Hartford area, I feel that we actually misunderstand who's responsible. Let's go back. Elizabeth Horton Sheff, she is the mother of the lead plaintiff in the case, and she and a coalition of Black, Puerto Rican, and white families in 1989 from the cities and the suburbs, they're the ones who sued the state of Connecticut and said, just what we're saying here tonight, there's two Connecticuts. I feel that when we end up sort of even informally say, did Sheff win or did Sheff fail or something like that, we're really missing who's responsible. So can we reframe it and say it this way? Have Connecticut's elected leaders succeeded or failed in implementing what the 1996 top Supreme Court in Connecticut, the state Supreme Court, said we need to do to guarantee quality integrated education, especially for Hartford's children? And when we ask it that way and put the emphasis where it belongs on Connecticut's elected state leaders, that kind of brings it back to all of us because they got those jobs because we voted for them, or you didn't vote. If you could be eligible to vote, but it's us. It's on us about whether this is succeeding or failing. But as your slide showed a minute ago, a number of Connecticut education journalists, Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, Adria Watson, and others from the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public, they're the one who's been pointing out that success isn't there. Less than 40%, about 41% right now of, as you said in the slide a minute ago, of Hartford's Black and Latinx children are in quality integrated school settings. And that's where we're falling short. We could be doing a lot more. There are state elected leaders who actually blocked a lot of this from happening in the interests of many people who live in places like I do, in the predominantly white suburbs.
Right. Let me follow up a little bit, and I'll come to you in a moment. Part of this question, I think, about success or failure, right, on the part of lawmakers is really this question about whether we see improvements in terms of educational opportunities and outcomes. So when you think about Sheff and what's happened over the years, in your estimation, are we seeing improvements in educational outcomes and opportunities for students in those schools?
Great way to frame it, Bilal. I've been in the Hartford area now for, I think this is my 23rd year. And I am trying to sort of like look at the long term here. What's changed and what hasn't over time. I'm one of the people who actually does criticize that things aren't moving fast enough. When people say Connecticut's the land of steady habits, that drives me crazy because kids need quality education now. They need opportunities now. Why are we continuing to wait and put this off? Come on. I talk to my students and I say, yes, this was a lawsuit filed in 1989 and the plaintiffs actually won the decision in 1996 and They're born in the 2000s. They think I'm a crazy old guy, which I guess I am. And maybe you are too, right? We both look at this for a while. But look at it this way. One of the things you can point to that's a big change is back in the late 1990s, when I arrived here, there was only one or two of these interdistrict magnet schools in the Hartford area. Now there's about 45. Now, let's not get too excited. I don't think they're the end all and be all solution, but what are they? Magnet schools, by definition, they have a special resources or special curricular theme to, like a magnet, draw families from both cities and suburbs together to be educated in a quality integrated environment. Some are located in the city of Hartford, some are located in the suburbs. But those schools and those special resources, there's a lot of quality education that's because of a direct result of this Sheff versus O'Neill lawsuit that Elizabeth Horton Sheff and those brave plaintiffs brought forward. And we can point to those as signs of success. What we don't have is we don't have enough quality integrated education for children, and we don't have enough opportunities and choices. This week, once again, the Regional School Choice Office will be advertising and saying, hey folks, anyone in the whole metropolitan Hartford area is welcome to sign up and put in their application for a magnet school, or if they reside in Hartford, to attend one of the open choice seats that might be available in a suburban school district. And that's great. That's going to be all the way through January 31st or so. And it's a great opportunity. People should check out the Regional School Choice Office and look what's available. But that's not providing enough choices to everyone. There should also be quality education at your neighborhood school too. I'm always impressed to see people who are doing great things in Hartford's public schools that are not magnetized, right, but may have a special theme. And I think Claudia here at Dwight Bellizzi dual language school. It's not a magnet school, but it's another example of a public school that's saying we can be trying to do better in serving a large number of Hartford residents, especially those who live in the immediate neighborhood.
So I know that Ruth-Terry looked like she wanted to say something. So why don't you jump in on that question?
I just wanted to
turn the mic on.
Okay, I think I'm here. Okay. Yeah. I agree about the importance of elected officials, particularly school board members. You talked about, are we doing enough? And he mentioned elected officials. As a general rule, the communities that you've spoken about, the Black and Brown and the low-income white communities, they participate in national elections, but they don't tend to participate in local elections. And we have seen the result of that nationwide in terms of state legislatures enacting laws that have literally strangleholded us in the areas of education and medicine and housing. And one of the things that we see here in Connecticut is that the school board elections are extremely contentious, and you would actually think that they're running for statewide election, but they're actually running for the school board. And the school boards are those entities that govern equity in schools locally. They wield a tremendous amount of power. And what we need to do is we need to educate these communities to become involved in the school board elections, because it's those school board and those members that will determine the quality of education, the equity of education for their children.
Right. Yeah, Claudia, you're in the trenches on this. How do you see this in terms of the way in which Sheff is actually helping to, or if it's helping to improve the schools?
So being in a public middle school in Hartford, I have had students here and there who have left, who got accepted, or, the wait list opened up for a magnet school. But I, as a teacher of 7th and 8th graders, I have had, helped my 8th graders do their applications into the high schools and do the regional choice, open choice, all of that. And it's very interesting to see what some of their families think about these schools. So there are some choices, but I have had parents who say, well, that's 30 minutes away by bus. I want them to stay here. I want them to be close by. They have to be able to walk to school. I won't be able to pick them up if anything happens. What if they miss the bus? Like, they have to go somewhere close. They want to go where they know, right? If they had older siblings who went to the neighborhood school, they will say, no, I have to go where my brother went. And so those students and their families aren't reaping those benefits of other magnet schools.
Yeah, and Claudia, you're alluding to this, and Jack, you mentioned it as well. You know, some say that Chef has created this kind of two-tier educational system, and you all are sort of referring to the magnet versus the neighborhood schools. I mean, is this really true that there is a two-tier system? Go ahead, Jack.
Okay, so hold on. Let's not say Chef created this. Remember the lesson here.
Got you.
The Connecticut Educated Leaders. Because remember, Bilal, pretend that you had filed the lawsuit. We'd be calling this the did Sekou fail? Did Sekou cause this? What if Dougherty did this? We'd be saying, did Dougherty cause failure? Something like this. It's our collective responsibility here. And why are we in this sort of like mess? If you go back to 1996, the Connecticut Supreme Court says, and it's a split ruling, it's 4-3, but they say, currently the system of educating Hartford children is unequal, it is not meeting our constitutional responsibilities. And they point to the two Connecticuts, those boundary lines that divide Hartford from West Hartford, from Avon and so forth, those boundary lines that people pay money through real estate to buy into, to get a guaranteed seat in an elite suburban public school. The state Supreme Court said, Connecticut is enabling the inequality by maintaining those lines. Now, that was the judicial branch. What happened right away with the governor at the time, John Rowland, and the legislators at the time, Democrats and majority, they represented suburban interests by saying right away, okay, we'll deal with this inequality, but we're going to do it through voluntary school integration. And you know how this, you've written about this and you've interviewed parents as well at that time. It's fascinating how we deal with problems in America. There's a system-wide, a systemic problem. How are we going to deal with it? Let's give individuals choice about whether they want to participate in a solution. Isn't that a fascinating way in America we deal with our problems then and now?
Right. Yeah. Claudia, you're in the trenches there. Again, I come back to you. I mean, do you get this sense in talking to parents that they feel like this is a two-tier system here?
Honestly, I don't feel like a lot of them are thinking about what's out there. Most of them, they want their child in school, getting an education, being somewhere safe. They have, what I found with most of our population is there are so many other things going on in their lives, or struggles that they have to deal with, traumas they have to deal with, that they know we're here and we're going to make the best of where we are. That's what I see, right? This is your school, you go here and you do the best that you can.
Okay. Do you want to say, go ahead.
You asked if there's a two-tier system, and I teach at the high school level, and I teach seniors in particular, juniors and seniors. And so our tier system is based on rigor. It's based on access, and I don't want to say tracking because we've really tried to eliminate tracking. That was 15, 20 years ago. Tracking was that system that you're talking about that created an inherent invisible two-tier system. What we have now is a system of children who are moved into advanced rigor, the advanced placement, their pre-advanced placement, the honors program. Those children get a different curriculum than, say, the general population. And so if that is what you mean by creating a two-tier system, then yes, we have a two-tier system from an academic standpoint. And that's a system that we need to eradicate. And if that's the system that you're speaking of, then yes, there is a two-tier system. And that is a system that, again, that goes back to parental involvement and educating parents on how to move their children into the best academic position that allows them advantages beyond the secondary education. And so in that system, yes, there is.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just one last piece in this, because we want to make sure it's, I want to make sure it's not unstated. There is a two-tier system in the sense that if our way of getting at some type of equal educational opportunity requires individual families to sign up, and remember I told you the deadline I think is January 30th or 31st or something like that, months in advance to get one of those scarce seats in a magnet school, because Connecticut state leaders have not created enough magnet school seats to meet demand. There's thousands of Hartford kids who don't get in every year. And if you think about it as, if I haven't even arrived here in this nation because I'm maybe one of these Afghan families that's just going to be arriving, or maybe I know where I'm living now, but maybe because of the pandemic and what's going to happen with a rental eviction and so forth, maybe I'm not in a family that's going to have a stable address. You could submit an application tomorrow, but if you aren't at that address to receive that reply, the system favors individual families with stability and of address and savviness of how a system works.
Right.
And that's a two-tier system right there.
Exactly. I mean, these are just great comments from all three of you on this. Now, let me shift this and talk a little bit about money, right? Obviously, which is an issue as well. So Connecticut ranks highly among states for overall funding per pupil, with an A from the Education Law Center, but it earns an F for discrepancies in funding between high poverty districts and more affluent districts. Some recent studies show that Connecticut needs to spend between $338 million and $1.7 billion just to close the spending gaps between rich and poor towns, what they spend per pupil. So Claudia, let me start with you with this first question. What are the needs from your perspective in the city's public schools that we don't see in affluent suburban schools, right? You know, what needs do we need to put money into the schools in order to respond to and to deal with?
So we have various populations that, for example, English language learners, right? We have a much higher percentage than in the surrounding suburbs. Special education, we have a high number. Right in my school, we had a vacancy for 2 years now. We have one English as a second language teacher for 3 grades.
Wow.
Grades in which over 30% in each grade are English learners. It is very challenging for that individual to meet students' needs and help them progress. Many of them who have just arrived, and they're sitting in an 8th grade US history survey course, having just come from, Tanzania, and they're still expected to be in this class and pass this class. So, if you are going to say you're going to give as much money for each, district for English language learning, well, we have a much higher percentage. So therefore, Hartford's going to need a lot more, right? That's one such example of where we need help with funding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're in Stamford. I mean, what's it like there for you?
The pandemic really demonstrated where the disparities were in terms of education, in terms of communities. When we went out last year, it was within hours notice. In other words, we came into school and many of the districts knew we got to school by 7:30. We knew by 10 o'clock that we were going out and we were going to stay out. Some of the things that we saw, which clearly demonstrated the disparity just in a city like Stamford, was the access to technology. We had children that we gave Chromebooks to. In other words, we made sure that every single child, regardless of where they lived, had a Chromebook. But we had children who did not have the internet. Their families could not afford the internet. We had lack of hotspots. And then we had lack of space. In the more affluent families, each child had a room in which they could engage in a classroom, a Zoom classroom, a Google classroom. When you looked at children in other areas of the city, you had 4 or 5 siblings that were literally closer than we are right now, each of them trying to have a Zoom classroom. And so that's where you begin to see the disparities in education. And then, let's keep it real, we had to feed not just children,
Right.
but we had to feed families. So when a family is trying to feed itself, that is going to be their primary focus.
And these are families that had lost their jobs because of the pandemic.
And if children are hungry, we know that children cannot concentrate.
Right.
So in other words, in terms of where we see a lack of resource, it's in the fundamental resources that these families need.
Absolutely. Jack, any thoughts on that question at all?
What do you call a state that gets an A and an F? I mean, that's a great celebrity. There's outside experts telling us how we're doing.
Right.
And it's like, yep, there's a lot of wealth in this state, but as your whole panel series is all about, there's 2 Connecticuts, or maybe 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how you want to slice it up. It's changed over the past several decades. But in terms of where that funding is going, we're not making it. I often talk with a lot of people about who said, is our goal to get equal dollars per student? And I say, think about this as, are we getting adequate dollars per student? Because not every student needs the same amount of education or not amount of resources to educate them. If I'm working with students who have in a school district, like Claudia says, with a high proportion of special needs students, a high proportion of students who are learning English as a second language, that requires more resources. And I think the past 18 months or so have made a lot of people, thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, think more about, what does equity really mean? Is it just equal dollars, or we should be thinking about broader systemic challenges that we're facing here in Connecticut?
Right, very good. Ruth-Terry, let me come back to you for a moment. And Claudia sort of opened the door to this with, English as a second language. We know that we have a lot of kids who are going to be coming in to the state from Afghanistan. And we were talking a little bit beforehand about some of the unique challenges that may present for the schools. Could you sort of talk a little bit about some of those challenges more broadly, but also very specifically to these students?
Well, first and foremost, we talked about this. As public school teachers, we're trained to teach to a diverse population of students. In fact, we look forward. I know I do as a public school teacher. I look forward to a diverse classroom, because the more diverse the classroom, the richer the classroom, the more cultural context, the more cultural richness. It's like a tapestry or a quilt that it becomes into focus. The longer the children are together, the more they begin to share things. So with that in mind, public school teachers are used to diverse populations and welcome diverse populations. The unique challenges that this population is going to face is, of course, they're coming into a country that doesn't know a lot about their cultural history, doesn't know about their religious history, doesn't know about their day-to-day norms. Many of these children are coming from single-sex schools, and they'll now have to come into a unisex environment in which they're sitting next to boys, and boys are sitting next to girls. So we'll have to navigate through that and make them comfortable in that environment, because it's a new environment for them. But it's an environment in which we can learn. We can learn how to foster gender equality and global equity in our classrooms. In other words, we can use this new cultural group as a way for us to really commit to sustainable development and education. That sustainable goal, that's the sustainable development goal number 4, which says that we want global equity, which means that every classroom provides opportunity for all children, regardless of their background, and that we want gender equality. And so if we can practice what we preach, we can actually model and show this new cultural group that we welcome them and we embrace them, and that we want to learn from them.
Right. And again, this is, as we talked, beforehand, this is an incredible challenge. And Claudia, for you, I mean, you you sort of talked about the lack of ESL teachers, but I don't think people have a full grasp of just how many languages, for example, are spoken, where kids are really coming from. The fact that even at home, English may not even be the first language, and the kids need to interpret for parents with medical issues, all kinds of things. Could you talk just a little bit to help us to sort of contextualize and really understand what that looks like in the schools?
Yeah, actually just today I had parent-teacher conferences. And so I had, a Swahili speaking parent, their child came about 1.5 years ago. I had them last year, so I'm familiar with them already, but we use something called Language Line, which is like a live translator on the phone. And it's like a 3-way call. And it's a great tool, but it does require that you have at least 10 minutes at a time, because everything you're going to say is going to be repeated back, right? So there's that extra bit. And then is it a time the parent's available? Are they working? My student's father works in one of the Amazon warehouses, and they're not allowed to have their phone on them at all on their shift. So it has to be, later, like 8 o'clock at night. That's just a little taste of it. But I mean, I think if we have, the Afghan students coming here, hopefully we're not putting them in a school such as mine, where we already have an ESL teacher completely stretched to the max, where she cannot possibly already meet her caseload. And then forget when she gets pulled for coverage because we're short teachers. We've had 3 leave since the beginning of the school year. So she's every day, doing coverages, and then again, not getting to work with those students and work on their English. So those are the things we really have to think about before we place these refugees. Are we putting them in the right schools that have resources for them?
Right. And when you say working with the students, I mean, how many languages are we probably talking about?
I know within my school, we have about at least 9 languages that I know of.
I got you beat.
You got me beat.
I've got you beat. Stamford is a sanctuary city. And so my high school in particular has it depends on the year, between anywhere from 23 to 31 different languages. And I have to tell you that I have taught classes where the only time that my students speak English is when they are in the classroom.
Right.
In other words, I've had classes where I have had students from Southeast Asia, every Latin American country, African countries, Southeast Asia, China. And what happens is that when I talk about this quilt, it's a perfect opportunity for true collaboration, because they rely upon each other to help each other understand what is going on in the classroom. And so you begin to see the world possibilities in your classroom.
Right. I mean, and that's just an incredible challenge. I mean, I grew up in Detroit, in the Detroit public school system, and we didn't have that kind of a challenge. And what you see in a state like Connecticut that is incredibly diverse, its urban areas are incredibly diverse, and those challenges for the public schools, and this question of how do we get the resources, as Jack talked about, it isn't just a question of spending the same amount, but getting the amount you need in order to be able to do the job you're trying to do. I'm actually going to come back to you, Ruth-Terry, about my next question. And I want to talk, as of next year, Connecticut high schools will be required to include a course on Black and Latino studies in their curriculum. You've said that you're teaching that course now. What impact do you expect it to have on students in both urban and suburban schools?
It's interesting. We don't have, in other words, there is an obvious need for it to be taught in, well, you say urban, but I would say a more metropolitan or cosmopolitan community. What we are having a difficult time doing is convincing those communities that are not more metropolitan, more global, the significance or importance of teaching the curriculum. They don't seem to think and I could be misquoting them, they don't see how it's important. But this is a country in which Black and Latinx people have been, well, Black people since 1619. And the Latinx and indigenous population has been here even longer than that. And so for you to not value that rich cultural contribution means that you as an individual miss a great deal of what America is. As an African-American woman, as someone who served on the advisory committee that developed the curriculum, every meeting was a meeting for me to learn. And so if as an educator and as a person who is a lifelong learner, if I'm able to glean new information as an educator and as a student, regardless of where you live in Connecticut, this is rich history that enriches not only your life, but the people around you. It makes you a better human being.
Right.
It's important.
You know, Jack, I want to actually pull you in on this question because like yourself, I teach at a university and I do courses on race and politics and urban politics. And I'm always amazed at just how much my students don't really know this history that they should be learning. I mean, your experience in teaching the kind of courses you teach with kids who are coming out of the public schools, many of them out of Connecticut, what's your sense of how prepared they are to have those kinds of conversations you want to have?
Yeah, students I teach and students I've taught in different places have a variety of different levels of preparation, usually not enough. And I really, well, I look back at it as, let's get the wording right. Connecticut is requiring every district to offer a Black and Latino studies course as an elective. It's not requiring everyone to do it. Back to that theme of like, we have a system-wide problem here, but we kind of have like an individual choice solution to it. That's the American way, at least I'm figuring out things. And I'm a kid who grew up in a rural white community. I was in upstate New York. Ruth-Terry and I were talking about this earlier. By coincidence, she knows the town I'm from. And it's not unlike a lot of, say, rural white towns in Connecticut. I didn't know a large portion of what I expect my students know about now, even just the basics of Black, Latino, and history. And I don't want our students, especially our white students, to be culturally deprived. That's a phrase that over the time has been reserved for what white people used to think of as African-American kids being culturally deprived. I think white people in America are culturally deprived if we don't know the contributions and the struggles of people who've been trying to make this a more perfect union.
Exactly. You know, Ruth-Terry, you sort of alluded to this. Do you experience pushback? We're in this atmosphere where everyone is talking about their teaching CRT or critical race theory. Are you experiencing pushback about teaching this kind of course? And do you anticipate possibly that kind of pushback will occur in Connecticut?
Let me give you an example. And I had this discourse just this week. There is no alternative to teaching James Baldwin. Baldwin is Baldwin, and he wouldn't be Baldwin if he wasn't Black. There is no alternative to Toni Morrison, and there shouldn't be an alternative to Toni Morrison. She is an impeccable writer who happens to be an African-American woman and a Nobel laureate. There is no substitute for knowing who Celia Cruz is or Tito Puente. They are virtuoso musicians. There is no substitute for knowing who Nina Simone is and understanding Mississippi Goddam and the context in which that song was written. And so when you say to me, is there a way or an alternative to these individuals? I have to tell you, then you really don't want your child in any of one of my classrooms, whether I'm teaching Black and Latinx studies, or whether I'm teaching English language arts, because you really miss the point. These are individuals who transcend race, but their race is at the basis of their artistic virtuosity.
Right.
And can't be substituted for.
feel like that's so profound. I'm like trying to search for how to follow that up, right? One of the things I do want to do is to encourage people, if there are questions in the audience, to write your question down and raise your hand so someone can pick that up from you and get that to me eventually. Let me shift once again, to talk a little bit about recruitment and retention of teachers. It was another sort of conversation we were having a little bit earlier. The Hartford Courant reports that public schools in Hartford are losing their new teachers at an alarming rate. 1 out of every 4 new teachers move on after their first year of teaching. There's also a shortage of diverse teachers in all the schools. And I think there's a slide that should be up. And schools filled predominantly with students of color. Slide 6 shows that only about half the students in Connecticut are white, which is the blue portion, right? While slide 7, the next one, shows that about 90% of the teachers are white. So Claudia, let me start with you first. How do you see these recruitment and retention issues playing out in your school, for example?
So my school very much reflects those statistics as well. We have very few minority teachers. We have seen, as we've begun the dual language program, which now goes up to 2nd grade, we have seen more Latinx teachers come in because they are doing bilingual classes. And we have taken on an assistant principal and a principal who are people of color, but the majority of our teachers are still very white. And we're told by the district and our Office of Talent Management that we have this goal of hiring this many more minority teachers, and but I don't really know what happens with it. And I think the recruitment is one thing, but retention is the really huge piece of it. And I don't really see us getting creative with programs, at least not currently. I know there are districts such as Boston Public Schools did the Boston Teacher Residency, which is like an apprenticeship program where you have teachers who are apprenticed with a master teacher, and they receive a stipend and they receive tuition reimbursement because you need that support, especially if you're not even getting a first year teacher's salary yet. And you then have a commitment of 3 to 4 years in that school district. And that has been really successful in raising the percentage of diverse teachers. But we don't have something like that here.
Right. Ruth-Terry, you want to say something as well. Go ahead.
I've been in the forefront of doing this for a while, and I agree. Recruiting a minority teacher is a complex and complicated thing. And there are a few variables there, particularly African-American men who are unicorns, by the way. An African-American man who wants to go into education, particularly in the STEM subjects of science, can literally teach anywhere. And that's really that's really the issue. In other words, if I'm an African-American man with a master's degree in science, I can really teach anywhere in the United States. I can choose where I want to teach. And so Connecticut has to make teaching in any district, for me, attractive, which means that there has to be community support. There has to be administrative support. And whatever teaching paradigm that individual brings to the table has to be supported if it yields results. And many times, that's where there is, controversy, as you well know. For other African-American and Latino individuals who have advanced degrees, private industry is competing for that individual, and it's about dollars. Teachers do not go into teaching to make money. They go into it because they're committed to imparting knowledge. And so there has to be that commitment there. And the reality is that most teachers do not live in the major metropolitan cities of Connecticut because they can't afford to. So they are commuting. They have families of their own. They have commitments. A commute, depending upon where they're teaching, can be extremely taxing. So, you know, it's a complicated metrics of why teacher recruitment is so hard. If I'm not getting support at work, if I'm having a long commute, if I don't have an economic incentive, if the philosophy of teaching that I want to bring to the table is being categorically rejected, then that's going to have me pack up and leave.
You know, one of the things I remember when I first came to the University of Hartford, I encountered a student of color who said to me, "You're like the first African-American male professor I've ever had," right? And I really understood the value of that experience for the student. So let me actually step back a bit with this question. What is the value of having, for example, males of color in the classroom teaching? Or just people of color in general teaching? Yeah.
In a high school, it's everything. In other words, you have young men who are on the cusp of stepping out into the world, and they have a man that they see every day who's there for them, who's encouraging them, who is guiding them, who's mentoring them, who's nurturing them, who's pointing out to them there's a rationale for you being here every day. It will lead to something. Just hang in there. In other words, even when it comes to conflict management situations, they can go to this African-American man, and this man can say to them, count to 10 before you start to swing. It's everything. I can't even emphasize it enough. When their teacher is sick or whatever, they're out in the hallway crying, saying, "I need my teacher today.
Wow.
I'm having a bad day. I wish he were here." It's everything.
Yeah. Claudia, you're nodding in agreement. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, having someone who looks like you and who understands your context in the world, your place in it, that has so much value. You know, just I may not be the most comforting person on that bad day for some of my children, who I look nothing like. And there have been studies that have shown that when you have those teachers that look like you and have, you know, experienced the world as you have, you're more engaged, you do better at learning. So yeah, you put that super
right.
Super well.
And Jack, you're helping to produce these teachers, hopefully. I mean,
I'd like to think that. I wish we'd be doing more. I think the point I was going to make was this. We all agree. We all want a more, we want to train, recruit, and retain a more diverse quality teaching force. And I think I'm just going to try to bring back to, your whole panel series. To do that, to achieve that goal, we'll go back to the prior panel. It's about housing to some extent as well. It's about having affordable housing, reducing exclusionary zoning barriers that make it so that hardworking teachers, and thank you once again for being here tonight, are able to afford to live there. And also it's to your next panel about regionalism as well. One of the panelists for the next session on regionalism, Tom Condon's here tonight, and I think his phrase was, when we were talking earlier about a number of teachers we've known who have, say, worked in Hartford, and just over the past year or so, during this real crisis of pandemic, they have been, I think the word was, poached by other suburban school districts. And I think Tom put the idea in my head, this is self-defeating localism when we're fighting against ourselves to do what we all want, to train, recruit, and retain a diverse quality teaching force.
right. Let me ask a couple questions that really focus on how do we move forward? How do we make things better? And let me piggyback on this about teachers and retention. I mean, what should be done? What are the things we need to be doing better to both recruit and to retain? Because I think this problem you pointed out of teachers also being sort of poached and pulled out of Hartford and going to other school systems. How do you keep them there? And you guys have sort of suggested some of the strategies with mentoring, for example, but what are some more specific things that should be done?
This is kind of a chuckle story, but you know, I am a lawyer and I am an educator. I'm both, and so I live in two worlds. And I guess this has been about 10 years now. I went to a black attorneys function, and there were young attorneys there who were curious about why I had left the full-time practice of law and become a full-time teacher. And so I sat there that evening and, you know, talked it up and, you know, about my children and what I, you know, was able to do. And I guess 2 or 3 years ago, I went looking for a couple of these young African-American lawyers. And finally, one of them called me back and says, "I'm not practicing anymore." I said, "What do you mean you're not practicing anymore?" He says, I said, "What about the other guy?" He says, "He's not practicing either." I said, "Well, what are you guys doing?" They said, "We're teaching." I said, "You're kidding me." And they said, "The last time we saw you, we had dinner." He said, "You talked up teaching so much, we quit practicing law and started teaching." So I mean, it's a true story. And so I think we're all educators here. You're a college professor, we're public school teachers. The way we do this is what we're doing right now, is we impart this love of what we do, which is to give knowledge to young people, to groom leaders, to model and emulate this love of learning. Right. And by doing it, by pollinating it, we create, we pay it forward and we pull young people with us. And this is the best way to do it. Right. Is to not just do this every now and then, but to do this continually.
I think they're listening to you out there. Claudia, you're going to say, look right.
And what you were saying about, you know, and I guess also as a lawyer, you would know this. I think that it all comes back to money in some ways, right? But if you look at, you know, what would make it more attractive? Well, you need at least a bachelor's and then a master's, especially if you want to bump in pay. So you think about all of that. Some districts even require a master's. Then there's the continued professional development. Many teachers I know go for a second master's so that they can also specialize in something. And then there is the, you know, keeping your certification and your credential that you pay for every few years. And that you know, happens in a lot of professions, but in those professions, they're also making more than teachers do. So why is that? How has this persisted, right?
Yeah. You touched on something that is so important. You talked about professional development. Every good teacher, as you well know, has to engage in continuous professional development. This isn't stagnated. You are a lifelong learner. You must continue to build your canon, create new content, learn. The other thing is that you have to use the primary source documents, but you also have to incorporate contemporary pop culture into your teaching paradigm. You have got to live in the world with your children. If you don't live in their world, you cannot engage them.
Right. Though I did try to talk about hip hop one time, and my students told me they didn't think I knew anything about that. So that one's tricky right there. So, my sort of final question before we go to some of the questions from the audience and also online. We've talked about a lot of things, and I want to sort of come full circle and really say, and ask you guys, is there a better way to improve educational equity and outcomes for students of color? Tell me, consult your crystal ball. Tell me what you think needs to be done to get this accomplished. And let's start with Claudia, and then we move across.
We talked about, having teachers, having educators around them that look like them, that can be their role models. I think that's huge. My students have noticed, and I've had students say to me, Miss, how come most of our teachers are white? They see that discrepancy even when they're 12, and they notice. So that diversity is so important as one thing. And making sure that all of their needs are met. There was something we were saying earlier that reminded me of a quote that I tell my students at the beginning of the school every year, which is equity is not everyone getting the same thing. It's everyone getting what they need, right? So I might need to tell you something once, but I might need to tell the student 3 times for them to fully understand it. And that's okay. We all have to get what we need.
Ruth-Terry.
The standards need to be the same. In other words, I may need to tell each student a different way what I want them to learn and how I want them to learn it, but it has to be the same thing. The content has to be the same thing. Yes, I may have to explain it a different way to 5 different student cohorts, but every single cohort gets the same content and there is the same rigor. The expectation is the same. And that's where equity comes in. The standards do not lower based on who's sitting in front of me. The standards are the standards. The individuals have to rise. And I have to give them the tools to allow them to rise to those standards. That's my job. That's how you correct equity. The teacher has to understand that the standards are the same for every child. It's how the child gets to those standards. That's on me.
Bilal, the question was, what can we do to improve education, especially to address the 2 Connecticuts? Right. And there's lots of structural things that need to happen. But I think as people listening to this here in the audience and also on the video are trying to think about what they individually can do. Well, I think one thing for sure is listen to teachers. We've got 2 excellent examples, and there's many more out there tonight who can give us wise, insightful ideas about what's working and what could be improved in the schools. And get more informed about what's happening beyond the teachers you may individually be able to have a conversation with. Some of the best journalism in Connecticut is about education journalism. And I'm thinking about the work of Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, longtime award-winning education reporter with the Connecticut Mirror, one of the, I think, sponsors of this event. Now she's with Connecticut Public, that's the public radio and TV and all this. And also Adria Watson, am I getting your name right, with the Connecticut Mirror, is also education reporter there now. Adria had a fabulous piece recently when all this kerfuffle came up about critical race theory. Right. She asked the great question and did a fabulous story. What are teachers actually doing? How are they teaching about race in America in their classrooms? Fabulous story. We need more quality journalism like that because we need to be educated in order to support individual teachers we know, but also to get more informed people running for these school board elections that, Terry, you pointed out. If you want to have people in those positions, that's something more local. Every school district in Connecticut can be doing. We could have better people on those seats. And I agree, some very contested races happened in some school districts this year. Other school districts, it was a lopsided race, but there were some very contested races. A lot of good people almost got in office. We need more information about what's going on now. And it's unfortunately, the Hartford Current isn't able to pull it off anymore. It's the new type of journalism. Connecticut Mirror, Connecticut Public, free to read, free to listen to, but not free to produce. We need to support them.
And as a member of the board of the Connecticut Mirror, yes, it's not free to produce, so do indeed contribute. Let me sort of come, full circle on this, say just a moment about my own experience of both teacher and parent. And my mother is watching, so hi, Mom. So, so let me just say, when I was in elementary school, speaking of teachers, I had a teacher who pulled my mother to the side and said, I really believe he has the potential to go to college, and encouraged my mother to send me to a different junior high rather than the one that was in the neighborhood. And here I am standing here, leading this discussion. And so that teacher stepping in, having that conversation, being involved, knowing the students, knowing what their needs are is really important. and also engaging parents. And I think, Ruth-Terry, you talked a bit earlier about parents, and I think that's a very important piece of this puzzle as well, making those connections between teachers and parents in that sense. Let me go to one of the questions online, which is sort of similar to a question I had that I was going to ask earlier. And this is a question for any or all panelists. Is a regional approach to education part of the answer to sort of evening out current disparities in the quality of education currently being experienced in Connecticut? As we know, school district boundaries really sort of determine, in some southern states, they actually cross across city lines. They've done a better job with integrating schools. And so maybe, Jack, let me start with you on that question.
Yeah. So I show everyone a map I have of what a typical school district size looks like in Connecticut versus most southern states and western states. And those other places are usually county-wide systems, and we are very tiny little buckets. And there's historical reasons why that in Connecticut. Why do we have such small school districts? I think we definitely should be looking at more regional types of solutions, and different people have suggested over time. I'm not going to put out there that that's the one-all, end-all silver bullet for reforming education, because as we know, you can have a school or a regional school district that has inequalities inside of it. Yeah. We've all seen that, but we don't want to replicate that. But we should be thinking, what are we, how are we holding ourselves back by having a bunch of tiny little school districts in Connecticut?
When you think about a regional school district, let's take Fairfield County, for example. I just want you to wrap your head around that as a regional school district with Bridgeport, with Darien, with Rowayton, with Norwalk, Greenwich, Westport, Southport, Stamford. Could you imagine that school board race? Could you imagine the number of candidates running for the school board and the disparity in the candidates trying to run and gain a seat on the school board? So be careful what you wish for when you start talking about regional education. I'm not saying it couldn't work, but I just want you to think about Fairfield County. And then think about some of the counties in the areas that are not what we would consider to be metropolitan. Imagine the disparities between the regional sections about how you would have a difference in the educational structure based on a regional system. In other words, Fairfield County would look completely different from Litchfield County, from Hartford, from the Torrington area. So I'm not saying it wouldn't work, right, but there would need to be a uniform body overseeing what these regional school districts would look like.
So you're raising really interesting questions about the power dynamics, certainly the class,
the modality, exactly.
Exactly. We're going to say something like, okay, yeah. Just to sort of piggyback on that, because I think part of this challenge, that the two of you and the tension between your answers is that I remember thinking about something Thurgood Marshall talked about, why he was pushing to integrate schools, because he also felt it was really difficult for white parents to ignore Black children if they were sitting right there in the classroom with them. And so in some ways, I think that's part of this challenge. If they're in Hartford or they're in Bridgeport and they're not in those suburban school systems, it's a lot easier to ignore their needs and their interests because those kids are not in your classroom and they're not a part of your schools. And so definitely a very interesting sort of challenge, but I can see the tension in your answer for that. And I got another question online, and I guess Diana will probably get me because I didn't show slide 8 about the questions and answers, but we're all right. So this other question here, for Connecticut's private and Catholic schools, does the state of Connecticut have any way to hold these schools accountable for diversifying their staff, faculty, and promoting equity or equitable equity for their students of color? And I know, Claudia, you've worked in both private and public schools. Can you maybe talk a little bit about maybe the thinking in those private schools?
I will say the private school I worked in was not in Connecticut. It was in New York City. So I think it wasn't quite the same. It actually was fairly diverse. So I'm not really sure I could speak to that in terms of Connecticut. But that would be pretty remarkable if they were able to. I don't know that they would be allowed to do that in terms of setting certain requirements for those schools. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that the First Amendment, the whole notion of separation of church and state, I do know that the 14th Amendment allows for resources to be given to private schools, books and things like that. I don't know whether the 14th Amendment would cover hiring practices. In other words, the incorporation clause there with, in other words, if there's any kind of state action, the licensing of the school, does that allow the state to then regulate who gets hired? When you consider that you don't have to have the same credential to work in a private school or a religious school as you do in a public school, that may change whether or not you can regulate whether or not that entity hires an individual. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Let me ask the question in a little bit differently, because I often talk to students, particularly students of color in my classrooms, who went to parochial schools, who went to private schools. And I guess the question then maybe is the issue of what are the sort of mechanisms perhaps that can make them more accountable? Are there things we can do with parents, for example, to inform them about how they can put pressures? And this could apply also to the public schools as well. Because I want to come back to this. I don't think we've talked enough about how we empower parents in this conversation about education.
Well, that could also be cultural as well, because depending on who the parent is, what their cultural expectation is, what their cultural boundaries are. I know that depending upon, what country a parent comes from, particularly if they're an immigrant parent, there's a dichotomy. My job is to get the child clean and fed and clothed, and to you, the teacher. Once I endorse that child over to you, your dominion is to educate my child and to give my child what my child needs to go out into the world. And many parents are so focused on providing them with sustenance, a roof, food, clothing, safety, sanctuary, if you will, that they draw that boundary and say, this is what I can do. I need you to do the rest. And so many times parents are so busy working that, when you try to call them, they'll say, well, can you handle that? Can you build and they want you to build a relationship with their child so you can handle that. And so it's a way of having to say, okay, yes, I can handle this, but I also need you to take this one step further. I need you to come in to see about your child. Don't call. I need you to come in. I know that you have to work, but I need you to tell your boss that you need an hour to come in. It's the perception. That's what we have to impart to parents, is that the perception that you care about your child is about your physical presence. And that's hard when parents are trying to take care of their kids.
Exactly. Let me ask this question that came from the audience, and maybe I'll start with you on this one, Jack. Which states are doing, you think, the best job at solving this problem? And what can we learn from them to make progress here?
Great question. I don't think I'm going to be as bold as one of those reports you had and give states letters A through F. But I am going to say this. I'm going to say that we in Connecticut, we can learn a lot from states that are doing some innovative things that we don't normally think of as innovative states. Here's the theme: dual language immersion schooling. Okay, what's the concept? Students of two different language backgrounds, could be English and Spanish, especially at young ages, are at the same school, and in a dual language immersion school, they're actually, both groups of kids are learning their home language and the other language with the goal of making everyone bilingual. Guess which state has been innovating with the most number of dual language immersion schools by far relative to its population? Utah. Now, that's not what I thought, right? But a number of people in Utah, which is also a state that Salt Lake City is actually diversifying in ways that I had not thought of for a predominantly white Mormon state. Utah realized that this is a way that we could actually draw upon the rich tapestry of families moving in, and also give a leg up to families who want their children to be part of the global economy. Now, I don't know if I'd buy that as the only argument for why you want to do things like this, but it is interesting to see that Connecticut can learn some lessons from what some other states that we normally don't think of as innovators.
I got a question here from Ted Carroll online. He writes here, in the quest for quality and integrated education, what if we focused on quality? In other words, if we made Hartford neighborhood schools not just equal, but better than suburban schools? What if Hartford teachers were paid more, given excellent professional development, provided wonderful instructional materials, abundant support services, et cetera? Isn't it likely that city schools might get more integrated? And even if not, wouldn't we be doing what's fair for those most in need? Claudia immediately reached for her mic, so let's.
Yeah, right. That was very well put, but I ask this question all the time. Why don't we? Why can't we? Imagine what our schools could be like and what a difference that would make.
This is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that every single individual in this room had a teacher at some point in their lives. And I know that every single one of us in this room remembers that one teacher that motivated us to be the individuals that we are right now. And so one of the things that we have to do in our society is stop saying to people, oh, you're just a teacher. You're just a professor. You're just an educator. None of us would be where we are without an educator. And so one of the things we have to do in our society is value educators at all levels. And that includes paying them.
This doesn't exactly answer that, but I will, yes, valuing teachers. I will say, having taught in 3 different countries, I had the opportunity to teach in Mexico and to teach in Ukraine. And very interestingly, especially in Ukraine, I was just out of college. I was 22. I wasn't that much older than a lot of the high school students I taught, but I was respected. What I said was what happened. I was never questioned by a parent when anything happened or there was an issue with a student. And just that in itself, that just helps so much to feel valued that way. In both of those other countries, they celebrate Teachers' Day, and it is a big deal.
Teachers' Day, what is that like?
I mean, your class makes the song and sings to you. You get all of these cards, you get bouquets of flowers. Coming home from school, people on the street, they see you're a woman carrying all these flowers. They know it's Teachers' Day and they congratulate you.
Wow.
It is incredible. And even there, teachers are not well paid, but there is this understanding of you are a key in our society.
Yeah.
You are so valuable for you. Don't forget they cook
do
for you.
They do.
Yeah. In other words, the love that you are shown in other countries as an educator it cannot be measured. In other words, and it's from the heart and it's sincere. And we in this country need to adopt that. That is one of the behaviors that we need to really work on, is valuing and appreciating the educators that we have in our society.
Absolutely.
At all levels,
Absolutely
at all
agree.
levels.
And Jack will give you the last word on this question. Can't follow that one.
They got it.
Exactly. So I think that's it for us. What a wonderful panel. Wow. Like going back to school just to be in their classrooms. Wow, just amazing. Let go to the last. There we go, right there. So again, we thank all of you, both in person and virtual, for joining us tonight. Please share what you learned, right? And that's something that Ruth-Terry talked a lot about, is sharing what you learned tonight. Watch your email for message providing you with additional reading and organizations that are doing important work in this arena. And please attend the final session, which is on December 8th on regionalism. And once again, thank you to this very wonderful panel and great conversation. Thank you so much.